All right. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to this combined call this month. It's a special occasion and doing it at a special day and time. Matt asked me if we could do this, and I said, sure. Matt is someone that I've known for a long time. He's been an active member in the SIKM leaders community going way back. I think we've only had a chance to meet in person once or twice here in the US. I think I missed you when I was in Australia 10 years ago, but we have had a chance to meet, and we've always had good relationship. I'm very pleased to introduce as our host for today's call, Matt Moore. Matt?
Thank you very much, Stan, and thank you to all of you for coming. So we're going to talk about knowledge management. We're going to talk about emotion. I want to start with a couple of polls just to warm people up, and also whilst I'm admitting everybody. Okay, so poll number one, nice and simple. Where are you based? So some answers, yes, we will be recording this, by the way. We are recording this. There will be slides available. There will be a download of the chat transcript. Okay, so 63% from Australia. So heavy Australian presence, Stan.
Great.
Okay, and then we're going to do our second poll. All right, so let me just quickly share the results of that first one. There we go. So mostly Australians. All right. Okay, and then we are going to do poll number two. So we are, let's try this. Poll number two. So how comfortable are you talking about your feelings? So I've kind of given like maybe 5 options. So we've got, I can't stop talking about them. I'm pretty comfortable. Depends on the circumstances, pretty uncomfortable, or I'm saying nothing. Okay. So let's see how we're going. We're going to run that maybe for like another minute or so. Let's just end the polling. I think we're good. So most people are like moderately comfortable, depends on circumstances. Some people like super comfortable, a few, and a few people pretty uncomfortable, or I'm saying nothing. So what I would say is this will be an interactive session. We will be kind of discussing things, but I'm not going to ask you at any stage to express your feelings. You can talk about other people's feelings if you want to. Right, but I think that's kind of interesting, and that's a good start for basing the session on. Actually, tell a lie, I am going to ask you to talk about your feelings just once. So let me just share that result so you can see. There we go. Stop sharing results and close that. So we're going to do a quick word cloud thing. Right, so what I would like you to do is to go to, if you're able to go to the Menti website, right? And it will ask you for a code if you go there, right? And the code I would like you to enter is, let me just get that. 7, oh, hang on. Boom, there we go. Try entering that. I'm just going to share my screen as well, just so you can see how that goes. Share. Okay. Is that working for people?
It says, no, it says could not be found on mine. Is it just me?
First time I'm using this. Never use a piece of technology. Okay. I'm gonna.
Hey, it worked for me.
Oh, good. Okay.
Let's see how that's going.
I didn't put any spaces in.
Okay.
Oh, the extra 6.
Ah, did I put the wrong code in? Sleepy, interested, good. caffeinated. Calm. Okay, so interested is kind of blowing everything out of the water. Ready to go. Okay, all right, cool. Thank you. So interested, sleeping. So everybody's in a fairly positive, worn out. Oh, frustrated, skeptical. Oh, throwdown. Fantastic. Love it. Okay, so let me change what I'm sharing.
That was
Can
just
you?
for you, Matt.
Thanks, Michael. Appreciate it. Okay, so can people see my slides?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so I just need to make sure that I can admit people if required. Excellent. Okay, so reference to a 1970s Boston song there at the kickoff. Okay, so right. So first of all, who am I? Look, I am an industry fellow at the University of Technology here in Sydney, where I have taught with Michael Olsen and Hilary Yerbury, who are on this call. I've had the privilege of doing that. I've had kind of 20 years of experience working kind of in and around knowledge management with some organizations you may have heard of, right? And I haven't really kind of been a knowledge manager probably for about the last 4 years. And I've spent, I haven't been pure in my sort of knowledge management work. I've ended up working in learning and development, marketing, IT management, sales operations, project management, all over the place. Often I will be hired to be a knowledge manager. There'll be a reorganization. It's like, now you're doing this, which is a wonderfully immersive way to learn things. And finally, I should note, I am not a trained psychologist, right? So we're going to, as we talk through this, I am an interested amateur who's trying to apply this stuff to their practice, not a research professional. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so the agenda, I'm going to probably talk for about 25 minutes. Then we will have 1 to 2 breakouts, depending on time. Then we will have a wrap up. Okay. So where did this talk come about? So back in the prehistory, I don't know if you can imagine this far back because it feels like it's a couple of decades. It's May 2019. And Stan Garfield, who I respect immensely, came to me and said, why don't you do an SIKM leaders kind of presentation? And at the time I was like, well, I don't know what to talk about. So how about I pick a challenging question for the KM community. So I say, what is the most confronting and challenging question for KM? What is our biggest fear? Now, what was quite interesting about that is I knew when I posed that, and I would have some people come back saying they didn't want to do that, right? Especially in a community that has a strong US presence. There's a woman called Lisa Feldman Barrett, who we will be coming to very shortly, who's done lots of research on emotion across cultures, right? And her comment is that Americans tend to prefer high arousal and pleasant states, right? If you want to kind of caricature it, America is almost like a nation of cheerleaders, if you will. So if you ask them to confront fears and confronting stuff, people would much rather focus on the positives, you know, which has some benefits and also has some challenges. So we kind of did that, and Stan has curated a wonderful list of responses from people 18 months ago, which we'll post a link to afterwards. The comment I would make is when I came back to this a couple of months ago, when I thought, oh, I really feel in the mood to do an SIKM leaders presentation now, I didn't actually want to present on this, partly because of all the stuff that's gone on for the last 6 months. I thought, well, talking about fears, it was interesting. So I actually did a session with James Dello and Richard Claydon back in March where we looked at how organizations were preparing for COVID. And we did like a word cloud, very similar to the one that we did just now. And the biggest words that came out were anxiety and fear. right? Because that was very much how people are feeling at the time, and how a lot of people are still feeling, I think. So I don't necessarily want to dwell on that. And I was thinking, well, I actually want to make this a bit bigger and a bit broader. So let's start thinking about feelings. Let's start talking about feelings. And my initial comment was, like, these are things that are rarely discussed, like, directly in the knowledge management world and in the knowledge management literature, right? They're alluded to, but not discussed directly. I started a discussion about this on the SIKM leaders group. Again, we'll post a link to that afterwards for people that aren't members. So many, many thanks to everybody that contributed to that. I hope I've got all your details there. I hope I've missed nobody out. Apologies if I have. So some very rich perspectives coming through there that we might come back to a bit later. But there were two kind of comments that came out that almost represented two extremes, right? So the one comment was almost like, well, why are we actually talking about emotions? How does that link to our practice as knowledge managers, right? I don't get it, right? And on the other hand, there were people saying, well, you say they're rarely talked about in KM, and I talk about emotions all the time. What are you talking about, right? So, and I think, and we'll come to that, but I think knowledge management is quite a broad space. And I think especially if you're a facilitator or somebody who does group work, then you do talk about emotions a lot. If you're busy designing a taxonomy, you might talk about emotions less. Nevertheless, I think it is important to knowledge managers. And at the end of this presentation, I hope to have convinced you that it is, and also discussed how it is and what we might do about that. Okay. Let's move on. So just very quickly, knowledge. Anybody recognize where this comes from? So a good friend, ISO 30401, that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. It's the ISO standard for knowledge management. So human or organizational asset enabling effective decisions and actions in context, right? Decisions, actions in context, okay? Now, when you start to look for definitions of emotion, you get a bit of a mixed bag, okay? And there are probably as many definitions as there are writers on the topic, but here's a reasonable one. So there's a woman called Cynthia Fisher who's done a great review article on the research on knowledge and organization, on emotions in organizations. That, again, there'll be a link to at the end. Her definition is emotion is an organized system of feelings, physiological responses, and bodily expressions, and action tendencies that flow from an almost instantaneous appraisal of the current situation's relevance to the individual. So if you look at that, right, there is a focus on action and arguably a focus on decision making, right? So I would say it would be surprising if when we started looking at the role emotion plays in knowledge and knowledge management, we didn't find a big overlap. It would be surprising if we found that it didn't play a major role, right? So, and on the other part of the slide, there's a table from an article from Shearer, and that's just basically saying that emotions are really, really complicated, right? There are lots of bits and pieces that make them up. Physical, neurological, social, psychological. They are not simple things. So just a few terms that we're going to refer to. So there's a big debate about affect in the SIKM leaders group, right? So related to emotions, it's kind of a technical term, and it's used in different ways, but it's often used to describe a relatively simple state of feeling or a discrete state of feeling, versus mood, which tends to refer to longer term, more diffuse emotional states that might take place over weeks. So like an affect or an emotion is something you feel right now, and a mood is the state of mind you've been in all week, potentially, right? And then the other terms that are bandied about a lot are valence and arousal. So valence is basically whether it's nasty or nice, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, whether, for example, you are happy or upset. And then arousal is your level of kind of energy, your level, what volume is it almost, right? High versus low. So elated versus peaceful, right? So a lot of the research around emotion has been saying, is it nasty or nice? Is it like aroused, high arousal or low arousal? Okay. Just as we go on, because we will be referencing these. All right, so how many emotions are there, people? I should have done this as a poll, but put it in the chat if you want to. How many emotions are there? Infinite. 12. 547,823, only constrained by language. Hundreds. Well, I'm sorry, you're all wrong. As anybody who has seen the Disney movie Inside Out, and if you haven't seen it, I would say, like, are you even human? Right? What is up with you? It's a fantastic movie. There are 5, right? There's joy, disgust, anger, fear, and sadness, right? I would say I think it's a fantastic movie. I absolutely adore it. Are there 5? I think, as people have said, like, there are probably more. This piece of research here identified 27 distinct emotions and how people were responding to videos. And researchers seem very, very interested in defining a specific list of emotions, enumerating them, cataloging them. There seems to be a very strong kind of taxonomic drive in emotion researchers. But, you know, I mentioned Lisa Feldman Barrett earlier. Oh, we're coming to her now. So a couple of years ago, she wrote a book called How Emotions Are Made. Now, I'm sure you've all come across authors who are like journalists or thought leaders, and they write a book and it's a bit superficial about a topic, but it's the basis of their TED talk and everybody loves it, right? This book is not like that. So Lisa's spent decades researching emotions as a psychologist, and this book is basically her life's work. And I found it fascinating. So thank you very much to Stephen Bounds for recommending that. Her position, which is very controversial, because as we know in academia, the fights are so bitter because the stakes are so low. Her position is that emotions are constructed by our brains and bodies. They're not discrete things. So people were saying there's infinite number of emotions. I think she would largely agree with that. And I think somebody else said, well, it depends on language. And I think she would largely agree with that too. Our cultural background shape how our emotions are formed. Emotions are not uniform across culture, and that multiple physical and brain systems are involved in emotional responses. And there is not and also, despite the folk theory at the moment, there is not a one-to-one match between what happens in the brain and in emotion. So, for example, the amygdala is often related to fear, right? Well, when you have a fear response, that doesn't necessarily involve the amygdala, and you can have emotional response that aren't fear-based that do involve that part of the brain. So it's far more. It's far more complicated than some of the traditional positions have said. And that's actually partly been a result of the artifacts of the research methods that we've used. And her final point, which I think is really, really important, is that we are far worse at reading the emotions of others than we think. We're obviously not terrible at it for the most part, because it's something we have evolved to do, but we're often not as good as we think, and we often make mistakes. So I think this is a fantastic book, and I would recommend anybody interested in this topic reading it. And finally, this gentleman. Who is this gentleman? Sorry, I'm on Zoom. I'm in lecturer mode. Who is this gentleman? It's our good friend David Hume, right? And David Hume has quite a controversial perspective, right, on emotion and reason, right? So we speak not strictly and philosophically when we talk about the combat of passion and reason. No, because reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, right? And can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. So our emotions are in the driving seat. And not only is that how things are, but as far as Hume is concerned, that is how things should be. I'm just going to leave that thought there. We might come back to it. Okay. So now emotion as an organization, let's start getting more specific. So again, this is a quote from Fisher's summary article, which I think is excellent. So yeah, for many years, emotions were ignored altogether in the workplace, or were regarded as irrational. Let's be blunt, they were considered feminine, right? So the organizations were, bastions of rationality and, let's be blunt, maleness, right? Or they were kind of considered kind of like a source of unreliability, and Six Sigma, there'd be a source of deviation to be reduced, right? And therefore to be removed, to be excised from organizations. And in some places, I think that is still the case. You still find people talking that way, right? Being emotional is considered, well, calling somebody emotional is considered an insult. Okay, I mean, that is true in some places, but that is starting to change somewhat. So emotional intelligence is now a thing, okay? And we'll talk about emotional intelligence just in a little bit. We've got happiness, wellness, a focus on positive psychology. Like, as tangentially to this, we've got an increasing awareness of mental health issues, which I think is all to the good. We've got employee engagement, which kind of talks about like employees' emotional states and sense of attachment. Elements of behavioral economics and naturalistic decision making actually refer to emotional, non-rational elements of decision making, of reasoning through, of almost thinking with your feelings. Right, so I see that work especially in the work of someone like Gary Klein. Right, and I think social media has actually changed our public performance of emotion as well. I think we have far more opportunities to emote in to perform emotion, and that is both to the good and the bad, the good and the ill. I want to focus on a few of these before I just kind of finally dig into the knowledge management stuff. I realize I'm kind of keeping you hanging. I do apologize about that, but I think kind of setting the groundwork is kind of important here. So emotional intelligence, right? So it used to be the case that intelligence was the thing. And then in the 90s, various people started saying, well, just being book smart is not enough. You have to be able to read people. You have to be able to understand yourself. Right, you have to be able to manage your emotions. I think we've all encountered people at work who can't manage their emotions, right? Especially people in senior leadership roles who do that. So it started off kind of very much with this focus on emotional self-awareness, emotional self-control, and relating to others. And over the last 20 years, it's kind of grown into this huge industry. There's been some criticism about it in terms of, well, is emotional intelligence actually a thing that you can measure? Does it actually track to performance? Right. So this is a recent thing kind of put out by, I think it's Daniel Goleman and co, who've kind of very much popularized this space. I broadly think that all this stuff is good. Right. I think actually having emotional self-awareness is good. I think having some sense of emotional self-control. I think the things on this chart are all good. Empathy, all that kind of stuff. I mean, this kind of came up because they were basically one way of talking about high emotional intelligence is people that are nice to other people all the time. Their comment was, well, that's kind of not enough. You sometimes you have to make hard decisions, and you actually have to be able to have tough conversations with people. So I think to an extent, the folk definition of emotional intelligence is not necessarily the same as the one that you kind of get in the literature. But also, I think looking at some of these, I scratch my head and I go, they're not just about emotion. So like coaching, it's not just about emotion for me. There are kind of all components to it. So I'm sort of broadly in favor. I do think it has become, like all like business movements, management fads, it's sometimes picked up and used in kind of harmful or unhelpful ways. And the other thing is, when you start looking at the literature on knowledge management and emotion, lots of it relates to emotional intelligence in both directions. So in other words, can knowledge management activities improve the emotional intelligence of people? And likewise, are emotionally intelligent people better at knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, knowledge diffusion, all those kind of things that we generally work in? Okay, next slide. So kind of a final thing I just want to focus on is emotional design, right? So let me be blunt. Most knowledge management tools, until recently, are ugly. They are fugly as hell. They are not lovable. Has anybody, I'd be interested to say, has anybody ever had their knowledge management system described as lovable? I'm getting some smiles there in the faces I can see. If you have, then shout it out to the rooftops, right? And that's not just about knowledge management, that's true about enterprise software in general, I think. Partly because it has been, the people that pay for it are not the people that use it. So it tends to be functional rather than lovable. It tends to be extremely rationalistic and complex rather than emotionally connecting with people. I think that has changed in probably the last 5 years because, you know, software as a service now means that you can buy something with your credit card that you like the look of and use with your team. Okay, so if we think about actually designing things that emotionally connect with people, there is a great book by a guy called Donald Norman, who I'm sure lots of you have heard of, called Emotional Design. Right, the picture on the front is an example of an object that he finds strongly emotionally attractive. It's a Philip Stark lemon squeezer. Okay, the version that he has is gold and literally has a sign on it saying, do not use this to squeeze citrus fruits, okay, because that would damage the gold finish. So in fact, as an object, it is completely useless, okay, but nevertheless, he loves it. It speaks to him on an emotional level. It's a fascinating book. Like all of his work, it tends to sort of wend its way through the space a bit, right? But his point is that when you think about the emotional connection to objects, you can think about them through 3 interrelated lenses. There's kind of a visceral lens, so how you immediately respond to it. So when you're talking to someone or doing something, do you like it or not? Is your valence positive or negative, right? Then you talk about kind of like the behavioral components that are more about function, understandability, usability, physical feel, right? So the classic usability traits almost that most kind of designers are focused on. And then finally, he has this kind of reflective domain, which is after you've used it or as you're using it for some time, you know, what emotional mood might it result in? What might your reflections on using it be? What thoughts and feelings does it prompt or inspire in you? So I think that's an interesting framework to actually apply to the kinds of products and programs that we produce. Okay, right, let's get specific. Yeah, sorry, it's making half an hour to actually get to the point, but knowledge management. So one of the best recent pieces of literature on this is by Hornig and Smolnik, who are 2 German academics, and it's a review of what the knowledge management literature has to say about emotion. Again, link at the end. Right, so they find about 32 articles. So again, there is not a huge literature on this, okay? And the interesting thing is, so they say, okay, how do we kind of categorize these bits of research? And they say, well, let's think about it in terms of the motivation to join knowledge management programs, how knowledge management processes work, and then in terms of knowledge management success and outcomes. And the thing they find is, you know, 2/3 of the research is focused on motivation, right? And it kind of breaks down that motivation research into what's in the diagram on the right. So again, there's a strong focus on emotional intelligence, emotive knowledge, emotional containment, emotional management, trust, pride, and so it's all about what motivates people to do things, right? Far less on actual knowledge management processes and knowledge management success. So from their perspective, that's kind of where the action is. That's where the opportunities are, like from a research perspective. And again, I think what was interesting is looking at the discussion on SIKM over the last few weeks. The focus has tended to be around motivation, right? Around the emotional motivation to actually share what you know or to lever what other people know and to kind of engage in that process, which I think is kind of interesting. The other thing that they've done, so this is a research paper that came out at the start of the year by both of them and a collaborator, where they mined the knowledge management literature and said, okay, if we start to mine for emotional concepts in the literature, what do we find, right? So I'm not necessarily going to spend a lot of time debriefing this because you can go off and look at the paper, but I think it's interesting that, so, you know, in our knowledge management programs, right, we want success and we want innovation. I think it's interesting that innovation and interest are linked. But also we're going to hit limits. They're going to be difficult, right? They're going to be risky, right? And also, yeah, things might go wrong. We might have failure. So, you know, as we manage our own way, and the way of our stakeholders and our colleagues, right, we're going to have to managing our emotions and theirs, right? Kind of coming back to that emotional intelligence idea. All right. So I'm now going to focus on what my experience has been. So one final concept I want to drop on you is the idea of emotional labor, which some of you might have come across, Arlie Hochschild. And this kind of came with her research in the 80s on people like waiters, service staff. So people in relatively low paid service industries, right? The fact you have to perform emotion as part of your job. You have to be nice to people, even if you're not feeling very good and you don't like them very much. Right. And one thing that I've actually found as a knowledge manager is because I have talked to lots of people across an organization, because that's kind of what you do. And B, because I'm perceived as relatively non-threatening, right? I have basically, people have dumped emotional stuff on me. I've kind of been like a therapist. You know, my standard line is, you know, please sit down on my couch. I'm going to start the clock. It's $200 an hour. Right. In fact, this happened to one of my colleagues when she was like working as a knowledge manager with a consulting firm, and she did it so much and liked it so much that she went off and did a counselling qualification and became a counsellor. Right. So I actually think that often as knowledge managers, we find ourselves doing emotional work, maybe not in the same way as a waiter, but very much emotional labor is a part of what we do. Right. I actually think that's true of information professionals in general when we're working with people. You know, my experience has been the need to read emotions, especially when I'm kind of doing knowledge capture activities. When I'm interviewing people, when I was interviewing people about projects in consulting firms, the first stuff they would tell me would be a load of baloney. Let's be blunt, right? And then as I, you know, it'll be like, oh, hang on, you've paused there. What's going on? Hang on, you know, this sounds happy, but you're not smiling. What's going on? So actually being able to read people, or even with, I think the critical thing is actually negative space is when people go silent, or the things that people don't talk about in reports, right? And that's often a fruitful source when you gently dig into it, of true learning in terms of what's gone on. I know quite a few people. Stan, you've like spent many years as a community manager, and I think one of the critical roles of a community manager is actually managing emotions, and managing the emotions in the community, giving people both permission to feel things, pulling them in when they maybe go too far. Another concept that interests me is the idea of emotional correctness. So I think there are some situations where there is social pressure to feel one way and people don't, right? And I think you need to give people, I think, often permission to respond to things in different ways. And I think related to that is the need to manage anxiety in times of change. So typically, a lot of the work where knowledge management has got a focus is when an organization is going through a transition. And that can be very anxious for people, right? And tempers can run high. I've had people slam the phone down on me, and some of you who know me go, you know, might go, well, that's no surprise, Matt. But in this case, it was actually not necessarily due to things I had done, right? So actually being able to manage the anxiety in a time of change, I think, is actually a critical skill that you need. Another thing is when you're trying to form groups, when you're actually trying to facilitate knowledge sharing, how you identify people who will click, and how you create processes whereby, you know, emotional risks are lowered, right? So in other words, where do you actually introduce people? Is it on like neutral territory if there's a potential for conflict, right? How do you create kind of low cost ways of, I think often it's not so much that people are scared of sharing their knowledge because they lose power. In a lot of cases, I think it's because they're scared because of the time commitment and what they might be buying into. So what's a low cost way of doing that? Well, you don't actually have to run a full day session. Just write a paragraph and that's fine. Again, when you're doing kind of project debriefs, another skill is saying what everybody's feeling, but nobody's saying, and also not saying things in front of people as well. I think finally, I think as knowledge managers, we do have to forge connections with people in organizations. Certainly that's something I've had to do, right? I've also alienated people as part of the process. And one thing I would say is I hate to alienate people accidentally. I don't mind alienating people on purpose. In fact, I think that's often something if you're going to make change, you have to be willing to do. But I hate alienating people by accident. And unfortunately, on some cases I have. So this is kind of almost like my experience, my confessions. I'm now going to throw it over. We're going to use the breakouts if people are good with that. So the first breakout is going to be, how might we manage the emotions of others as knowledge managers? So rather than, I kind of want to take the stress off people. So I want to think about a time you witnessed a display of emotion in the workplace. What was the context? How did you react? What did you learn from that? And I'm going to put you in breakout groups, if that's okay. So let me hit the breakout group button. Let me stop sharing my screen. Pause the record. Okay. How did it go? Anything that pops out for people? Maybe you want to share anything?
Well, I just want to observe, Matt, that as soon as you announced that you were going to the breakout room, the attendance dropped from 58 to 42.
Some people just don't want to participate, eh?
So there was an emotional response.
Look, we've just shaken out the casual people. It's just the committed that remain, Stan. That's all. Any other observations or comments?
So our group talked a lot about the emotion as a social construct, and how working in different cultural contexts with different groups, emotion is expressed in different ways. Expressing emotion means different things. I talked about my experience of working on one research project where I went from working in Finland to working in Italy. Anyone who doesn't think emotion is a social construct just needs to take that short flight. So I talked about one of my major problems with most of the literature in the KM, and indeed the management and information science space around emotion, is that it doesn't consider that, and we have far too much work which is done by, let's be honest, mostly middle-class Anglo-American academics working with other middle-class Anglo-American groups, and then creating models based on that specific cultural context that are then labeled general models.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Any other comments or feedback? I think now a couple of people did end up in groups on their own, so my apologies about that. If that happens, let me know and I will just redistribute you forthwith. You can kind of like flag up in the chat, or I think Jessica actually said, "Help! I'm here by myself." Any other comments or feedback? You don't have to, but any other comments or feedback from people about other people's stories that kind of stuck out to you? Okay, that's fine. Now, we're going to do another quick breakout, if that's okay, before I let you go. I might actually just see, so just before we do that, are there any questions so far? Or even comments?
I had one for you, Matt.
Sure.
In the study that you quoted, when they reviewed the literature, was it strictly academic literature, do you know, or did it include a non-academic literature?
It was academic literature, right? So as much as I think their work is a good start, as I think I said on the list, I would love Horning, Smolnik and their collaborators to actually reach out to the world outside the academic literature. And also, I think it's important to note that if you want to find a place where they've tried to remove all emotion from writing, then academic literature is the place to go. Any other comments or questions? Okay, well, before we wrap up, another quick breakout. And this is actually about emotional design. So, and I'm going to give you 4 minutes to do it. So, here, come on. Here is the question. Seamless, isn't it? Seamless. It is, how might we design our KM products and programs to account for emotion? So to do that, I would like you to think of a work initiative or a software tool, or if you can't think of any, if none of these resonate, any product that has provoked an emotion in you, good or bad. You could want to hug it, you could want to throw it across the room. And again, why did it provoke that emotion in you, and what did you learn from it? So does that make sense? I'm going to put you back in your rooms just for another 5 minutes. Breakout rooms. Recreate. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We're coming up to time. Any final comments based on that last discussion? Anything that stood out?
We needed more time, Matt.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
I was going to just add that in my discussion with Angela, thank you for sharing, it made me realize that making a knowledge management system or any system that doesn't work for people is kind of no longer okay, given how much free systems such as Facebook, YouTube, all those things, or even paid ones like Netflix, they're really user-friendly. So it's kind of expected. Like back in the day, I can understand if I had to use something that was a bit ugly, it's like, oh, this is the way things are. But I think now it's difficult to say, oh, this is as good as it gets, because like, no, I can find what I need to find on Netflix pretty quickly.
100%. The game has been raised. Absolutely. Thank you, Solly. Any other comments, questions, thoughts before we wrap up? So, okay, all right. So thank you.
I do have a question.
Oh,
Is it
Julia.
possible? Is it possible to get a copy of your presentation?
I was just coming to that. So what we will do is we will share the video of this. I will make sure that Stan has a copy of the presentation for SlideShare. If any of you want to record the group chat and download it, you can do so now, and I will make sure I have a copy of that as well. So yeah, we will have the full multimedia experience for people. So I would just like to round it up by thanking Stan again for inviting me to do this. I do appreciate that. And I would like to thank all of you for participating. Big round of applause for yourselves, please.
Thank you, Matt, very much for leading this discussion and